Welcome everyone to Cultural Connections, and mae CysylltiadauDiwylliannol yn rhoi mwy o wybodaeth I chi am enwyr lleoedd a'r diweddau lle rydym yn byw. And some of the names that we give places that we live are named after people, descriptions, historical events, and anything in between. But this video is going to be flexibly bilingual. So some is going to be in English, a bydd rhai yn Gymraeg. Mae gennym lawer o westeion gwych heddiw. I'll introduce those guests very, very soon. But this is part of the Cultural Connections project commissioned by Merthyr Tydfil County Borough Council and being delivered by a team led by TACP, but it comprises of Black Mountains Archaeology, GeoArch, Hugh James Media, and Jack Pullman Slater. Mae gan bob rhan o'r tîm gefndir a sgil wahanol. So on the webinar today, we have Harry Evans, who's from Merthyr Tydfil County Borough Council, Tim Ryblewski, an environmental planner with a geography background from TACP, Richard Lewis, an archaeologist from Black Mountains Archaeology, Tim Young, an archaeologist from GeoArch, Jack Pullman Slater, a Welsh language tutor researching the Welsh language through Cardiff University, and then me, Hugh James. So to kick us off, why don't you introduce the project, Tim?
Okay, thanks Hugh. So Cultural Connections was a project born out of a concern for the loss of Welsh place names in and around Merthyr and Ronancuff County Borough Councils. And the project is really intended to engage with the public, understand the significance of place names in the region, and then present those back to them and try and promote a bit of understanding about the origins of place names and why they change, where they've changed, and perhaps encourage the use of more traditional place names. It's an important project to try and preserve Welsh culture for future generations. And we're hoping that this webinar, along with the other material that we've put together, a series of podcasts and story maps accompanied by videos, we're hoping that this material is a useful resource for teachers in the classroom. And this webinar in particular, we're hoping is a good summary of the key kind of themes that the project's looked at and present some ideas as to how you might explore those themes across the curriculum.
Yeah, un o'r rhesymau tu ôl i'r prosiect yma yw poblogrwydd apps gweithgaredd, sort of activity apps, yn enwedig gyda bobl sy'n hoffi beicio, cherdded a rhedeg falle, a sut mae'r appau yma yn dylanwadu ar enwau lleoedd yng Nghymru heddiw. Dyn ni'n gweld falle enwau newydd yn cael eu fabwysiadu am lleoedd yng Nghymru a sut mae'r enwau hynny yn cymryd drosto enwau traddodiadol. Be sy'n braf falle yw gweld fwy o Gymraeg yn cael ei ddefnyddio yn yr apps yma fel canlyniad i'r prosiect. Fel efallai enw pop-tipping sy'n mae Bike Park Wales yn defnyddio un o'i runs nhw heddiw.
Yeah, and that's something that we've found time and time again, as more and more of us use in this digital age things that appear on maps or appear in I use so many different map apps and tracking apps, and I see all these different names and all these different things coming up. One of the things I've loved about the Cultural Connections and Landscapes project is that regardless of what I see in front of me, it's driven me to learn more about what is actually in front of me, not what's down here, if that makes sense. So I've loved being part of this project for so long. We've been postponed through COVID, and it just made us kind of spend that much more time in it and be such a bigger part of it. And what's really kind of jumped out at me is that the cultural connections that we have to the places around us and the place names really jump into lots and lots of different parts of our lives. And it just so happens that within our schools, we have lots and lots of different kind of subjects and topics and things to think about. And there isn't one of them that I don't see a purpose for the Cultural Connections and Landscapes project within, all those different things, and also a cross-curriculum as well, which is not something we're always striving to do more of. So, Tim, what are the kind of subjects and cross-curricular topics that we can start to think of within this project?
Yeah, you're right. The project's applicable across, a range of topics taught in schools across the curriculum, at humanities level, geography and history. Health and well-being is a big factor in the curriculum now. The expressive arts, music, art, and then languages, literacy and communication, clearly a strong component there. But even maths, numeracy, science and technology, there's aspects of this project that can be brought into those lessons. So what we're going to do is just explore some of those areas of the curriculum and look at some of the perhaps place names and stories that we've uncovered, using those as an example, and look at ways in which those examples and these topics can be taught about. Jack, I'm aware that there's a new curriculum coming in. Are there any particular aspects of that fit well with this project?
Oes, heb os. Felly bydd athrawon sy'n gwylio hyn yn ymwybodol am y newidiadau mawrion sydd ar y gweill o ran pylu'r gwahaniaethau rhwng pynciau traddodiadol a sut y bydd y dysgu yn cael ei drefnu o amgylch 6 maes profiad a dysgu. Ac bod y prosiect CysylltiadauDiwylliannol yn ymwneud â rhywbeth sydd yn ieithyddol, sef y dirwedd ieithyddol, yn dyfe, mae sgôp sylweddol yn hynny ar gyfer ei ddefnyddio ar draws ystod llawn y meysydd cwricwlwm newydd, ac mae hyn oherwydd natur yr enwau sydd dan sylw. Dyma enwau wrth gwrs sydd â chysylltiadau cryf iawn i hanes a lle a pobl a iaith, ac hefyd o ystyried y ffyrdd yma mudiadau fel eich mudiad a'ch sefydliad chi wedi defnyddio ffyrdd technolegol a daearyddol o ran coladu, mapio a chofnodi yr enwau hyn.
One of the things that, when we push forward with the education in Wales, one thing that I'm always kind of looking more for is, well, I love the more vagueness of the curriculum as we go forward. We talked about offline the fact that a curriculum now is less of a curriculum, more of like a framework that everyone can add into. And what we're hoping to do with this project really is to provide some resource, a little bit of a jumping off point to start talking about these kind of things. And it can be in absolutely any subject and any topic. The one that jumps out at me really is the humanities. When we get into things like geography, whether that's human geography or physical geography, and whether that's history or RE, any of them. Tim, the amount of things that you could do with this project are kind of limitless.
Yes, you're right, Hugh. And geography is a good starting point there because particularly in Wales, a large number of our place names are derived from the physical landforms that surround us. The streams, the hills, the rivers. They all, they're incorporated into several of the place names in this part of Wales. And when you get to the secondary age group, you can really split it down into the human and the physical side of things. So you can bring place names into understanding more about sense of place and developing that further into looking at some of the sort of the key issues that are affecting Southeast Wales. And a big factor at the moment is landscape crime, and there's a number of reasons behind landscape crime, but a significant component and driver behind it is a lack of connection with the landscape, and sort of a loss of sense of place. And we explore this quite a lot during some of the podcasts that we've put together, so I'd encourage you to go and have a listen of those. But it would be a good opportunity to use a geography lesson to explore landscape crime and explore some of the places that affects and why it's important to preserve those places and look at the origins of those place names. And then from a physical geography component, you could look and explore the geomorphological processes that have shaped the area and led to the resources, thinking about the coal that have given rise to some of the place names and the collieries and the industry that's developed in this part of Wales. And there's a few sort of key themes of geography that you could have a look at. Clearly there's maps, but going beyond just paper maps, you could look at GIS, geographic information systems, look at computerized mapping, spatial analysis. Clearly this is pitched at a range of different ages, but at the secondary school level and particularly at A level, some of these topics would be highly relevant. And even looking at things like environmental impact assessment, which draws on a number of different topics, some of which we'll discuss now. But it's it's very geography focused, and there's a significant focus during the IA at looking at preserving cultural heritage, looking at preserving place names and incorporating those into projects. So there's a few key themes of geography there that you could explore place names through.
And one of the obvious things when you're thinking about place names that go back into the past is thinking about the history of it. And, I chose geography at GCSE instead of history. I've always wondered why that's a choice I have to make. I would love to have done both of them. But looking back into the past is a realm of history, Tim Young.
Yeah, and I think place names provide a really good let-in to some of the key themes. Key Stage 3, we've got an emphasis on evidence and sources, and these are really great things to address through the evidence for place names. Not only the current story and trying to interpret and think back as to what place names mean and how they might have originated, but also looking at maps, the evidence for how those place names have evolved over time, thinking about documentary sources, and of course thinking about the relative ways in which place names are created and used between oral mechanisms and the more formal mechanisms of things being written down and used by used in an official sense. So there's all sorts of things there about evidence and sources that you can approach.
Yeah, there's with the digitalization of everything. We live in a digital age. We're doing a webinar, so that there's a massive volume of material which is now accessible online. So the students are able, for example, to access a huge mapping resource on the National Library for Scotland's website. Here in Wales, we have digital resources called Historic Environment Records. We have two different sets. We have a national one and curated by the Royal Commission of Ancient Monuments, and we also have regional ones. So for the four sort of corners of Wales, there are these regional websites which are links to even more resources. The National Library is another great resource. They've recently digitised all of the tithe maps of Wales, which is an incredible archive, because not only does it have the mapping evidence from the 1840s for pretty much the whole of Wales. There are a few minor gaps, but it also has this big document called an apportionment, which actually lists who lived in these land parcels, what was the land used for, and you can cross-reference that with the census records at the same time. So when we're talking about evidence and building on evidence, there's at your fingertips. There's a massive resource there for students.
Yeah, there's a lot of resources out there, and we're hoping to just add to what's currently there. One of the things that I think about a lot at the moment, it's just coming to the forefront within Welsh education and Welsh culture, is how these places came to be, and how these massive structures got made, and the industrial age and everything like that. And Harry, going through, we talked offline about how places like Father Castle and things got made. I know it's more of a push to just teach about the slave industry as it pertains to Wales and the culture that was here in the past, right?
Yeah, mae'n wi'n credu bwysig cofio weithiau bod bywyd rydyn ni'n byw nawr yn cael ei siapio yn fawr iawn gan y chwilio diwydiannol. A pan fyddwn ni'n sefyll falle yn llefydd fel adfeilion gweithfeydd cyfarthfa, fod yr arian a helpo sefydlu'r gweithfeydd yna wedi dod I ryw raddau o leia o cathweithiaeth.
Yeah, those conversations are things that we're starting to come to more grips with at the moment, and they're massive things to get our heads around. And one of the best places to do that is through kind of writing, through music, through expressive arts. And, Tim, this is something that I know is in your wheelhouse. You paint all the time, right? And the history, the culture, the geography all comes out. We could do things within the expressive arts in this.
On both fronts, that expressive arts are not my bag, but that also, there really is great scope to explore the project through, the topics of music and art. We've talked a little bit about some of the myths and legends. They make they form a big component of Welsh culture, and that's evidenced through the place names in the region, Merthyr Tydfil, for example. And there's no reason why, in drama lessons, we couldn't look at acting out those myths and legends, or even interpreting them slightly differently. And one approach to this is perhaps using the hot seating technique, which involves, a student becoming that place or becoming that myth or legend or a character in a story, for example. And then the rest of the class essentially asking them questions and investigating what that person is, pretending to be. They could look at learning about a specific style of art and then drawing or painting pictures in that style of places in the region. And one thing that I find quite interesting is the Cities in Memory project, which is looking to map sounds across the globe. So they could look at adding to that, just recording the sound of a place of significance and adding it to the map, or equally, interpreting those sounds themselves during music lessons. There's also, a great deal of Welsh musicians and music. It's a strong part of Welsh culture, hymns, etc. So they could look at exploring those, creating and writing songs, playing the music, and just discussing and sort of understanding, critically sort of reviewing and understanding the background behind some of those songs. I'm the wrong person to ask, but I don't know, Jack or Harry, if you've got any good examples, or if you've got any favourite Welsh musicians that reference place names in their songs. I'm putting you on the spot there a little bit.
Yeah, I think you're right, Tim. We in Wales are known for our music and our singing. You wouldn't know it from hearing me sing. I hear Harry's really good with a guitar and a good vocal. But we are the Welsh language seems. I'm listening to more and more Welsh musicians at the moment who are Welsh language musicians. And Jack, like that culture of Welsh music, I don't know if it's because I'm just listening to him more now on Spotify and the likes, and I've just always got it on in the background, but I feel like it's making a bit of a resurgence, right? That Welsh music scene.
Ydy, hebos, ac yn bendant yn yr ardaloedd sydd dan sylw'r prosiect hwn, achos dwi'n meddwl dyn ni'n dueddol efallai yng Nghymru I feddwl bod diwylliant neu gerddoriaeth yn benodol yn rhywbeth sy'n perthyn i'r gorllewin ac i'r fro Gymraeg arfordirol. Ond wrth gwrs dyw hynny ddim yn wir o gwbl. Mae gan yr ardaloedd dan sylw, yr ardaloedd ddwyreiniol hyn, gysylltiadau cryf â cherddoriaeth a chwedle ac ati. Ac mewn gwirionedd, dyn ni'n gweld bod rhyw fath o ail-greu neu ail-siapio'r fro Gymraeg ar waith yng Nghymru wrth I bobl symud I fyw yn y trefi, ac hefyd wrth I fwy o bobl ifanc dechrau astudio trwy gyfrwng y Gymraeg, yn enwedig yn ardal yr Rhondda a Merthyr er enghraifft. Felly dwi ddim yn wir o gwbl I ddweud mae rhywbeth sy'n perthyn i'r gorllewin yn unig yw diwylliant Gymraeg a Chymreig.
No, sy'n ni'n hoffi dweud hefyd bod ni'n clywed bandiau cyfoes nawr yn canu nid unig yn Gymraeg ond yn canu'n dwyieithog yn yr un gan weithiau. Mae hynny, yn anffodus, dwi'n eitha hen nawr a wi ddim lawr fan our kids, right? So wi ddim yn gallu meddwl am enw'r band, ond wi'n clywed yn aml ar y radio bandiau sy'n canu yn Gymraeg a Saesneg. A mae'n grêt gweld hynna'n digwydd yn yr ardal yma, yn enwedig yn y cymoedd. Hefyd, mae yna nifer o enghreifftiau o bobl lleol sy'n gweithio yn y cyfryngau, fel Shelley o Cwm Rhondda sydd â rhaglen wythnosol ar BBF Radio Cymru. So mae'n grêt gweld hynny, bod y Cymraeg yn fyw ac yn iach yn yr ardaloedd yma.
Yeah, Harry's completely right in what he says there, and it's in that it's something positive to see, and that those kind of bands and music where they're using the language flexibly and bilingually more reflects how Welsh speakers actually use the language, because of course English and Welsh have been together in Wales for since the Norman invasion, so it's only naturally that we use them both, and we don't create an artificial distinction between them, just as we're doing in this webinar by using the two languages naturally.
And that leads us wonderfully on into things like languages, literacy, and communication. Obviously, there's big changes within the secondary curriculum over since I was in school, which is further ago than I care to remember. Actually, I feel like it was just the other day, but it's definitely not. So there's always changes, and there's always new things that we can do. So within the new curriculum, I suppose, and leading forward into the future, what are some ways that we could use cultural place names, landscapes, but projects like this in the languages that we teach?
Well, in terms of the languages, literacy and communication area, the place names topic lends itself very well to a kind of debate format in which you might get the kids to understand the abstract notion of cultural heritage and tap into some of the ongoing and sometimes controversial debates that there are in Wales about the preservation or eradication of place names. So you might get them to do something like rename the place that they live in Welsh and English, and then justify their decisions in a short write-up or presentation. And then you could provide them with translations of the constituent parts of those place names in Welsh, like Aber, Nant, Llan, Newi, Pont, Ucha, and so on. And then get them to justify their decisions. And an extension of that could be having counter-arguments, where you set up a debate between the kids about the importance of preserving these place names. Ac o ran y myfyrwyr hynny sydd ar Gymraeg yn iaith gyntaf iddynt, neu efallai nhw sydd â sgiliau Cymraeg mwy hyderus, efallai gallwch chi gynnal rhyw fath o dasg ieithyddol ein natur, lle dych chi'n gofyn i'r ddisgyblion gwneud pethau fel hollti geiriau a datdreiglo enwau cyfansawdd neu gydnabod strwythurau penodol o fewn y geiriau, enghraifft cydnabod strwythurau genedigol, neu hefyd efallai cymharu ynghaniadau. Ydy pobl yn dweud clydach neu cludach, enghraifft bigail, neu a oes yn rhywun sy'n cofio pobl oedd yn dweud bicail gyda c yn y canol yn lle. Ac hefyd efallai ymestyn hyn drwy fathu enw Ffrangeg neu Almaeneg neu Sbaeneg ar gyfer y lleoliad hwnnw. Felly, neu rhyw fath o dasg lle mae tair iaith gyda ni yn hytrach na dim ond dwy.
And as someone who's come up through the Welsh system into, I think I learned Welsh until I was about 14, and then stopped. But obviously I live in a place in the South Wales Valleys that's surrounded by Welsh place names. And I only, through this project, went out and looked up the town that I live in, the actual translation of that and why it was called it. There's still no signs of a bridge over a speckled lake that I can find around by Pont Llyfraith. But, I've always thought that I always try my best when it comes to pronouncing it, even though I'm not a fluent Welsh speaker. And is that, where we're pushing towards with non-Welsh, non-fluent Welsh speakers, or is it still like you have to get the pronunciation right, you have to get everything right to be called fluent or to be called a learner?
Well, I, as someone who spends all my time teaching and researching Welsh, really refute the idea that there's a correct pronunciation, especially because we have a very interesting situation in Wales now, particularly because of our school system, where the number of new speakers, so people who are second language speakers, vastly outnumbers those who have the language as the first language. And this doesn't mean that their pronunciation necessarily needs to take over, but it does mean that it's there. And sometimes we have examples where what's perceived as a second language pronunciation or a poor pronunciation is in fact possibly more original. And a good example of this would be something like H dropping in the old area of Gwenhwyseg, the dialect that would have been spoken in the area that this project looks at, because actually when you look at texts and even old recordings from the beginning of the last century, you can hear that people were H dropping in Welsh. So it's not the case that them saying triaris, for example, is poor pronunciation. So the lines are so blurred between what's correct and what's not, and what's new and what's old, that we should really say that anything goes, not because we're being lax, but because we're acknowledging that English and Welsh exist and have existed in Wales for ages.
And Tim Young, like, that's something that we've seen through the history of the place names and how language adapts from, one thing could be named something for a while, but then it mutates and changes, and then it's called something else, and then it's called something else. Like, we can really learn something about our language from looking at the history of all these different places.
Yeah, and that's quite a technical issue, I guess, is trying to unravel how place names have evolved. It comes back to this evidence and sources again. It's very hard to know how people pronounce place names in the deep past because we only have the way they were written down. But maybe, we've talked about strange spellings creeping in because English scribes were writing down Welsh place names, but maybe that's actually giving us a little bit of evidence as to how people heard those names at the time, because they're trying to write something phonetically. So there's all sorts of quite subtle things about the evolution of place names and deep time. And if you take some of the oldest place names, things like the River Taff, we can be reasonably certain that goes back possibly thousands of years. But when it was first used, it probably didn't sound anything like Taff. But it's just evolved continuously all the way through that long period of time.
You've only got to look at, as both Jack and Tim said, we've got the written record. If you look at the in the podcast, we spoke at some length about how Rigos was pronounced, and we came to the conclusion that there was many ways. Locally, it's the Ricos, but if in written Welsh it's pronounced slightly different again. But also we've got documentary evidence that name goes back to the 14th century. So how somebody, fighting the Normans in the 14th century and in the hills, would have spoken that, we just don't know. But by actually tracing these names back, it really enriches what we understand about our landscape and how our society has come from there to here, and the fact that we've got these apps that and people are recording different names now, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. That's just the natural evolution of languages, and we should treat these changes in the same way we treat historic place names. They should be recognised and recorded, because don't forget, in 500 years time somebody's going to be very interested in early 21st century Wales.
We also had an interesting section in one of the podcasts where we talked about multilingualism in the past and how at times in Welsh history there were other languages involved in the mix, and so we have early medieval inscriptions which were using Latin and early Irish, not perhaps Welsh in the written word, but we assume that Welsh was being spoken perhaps as the everyday language of the people who were also having to deal with Irish and Latin at the same time. So we're seeing age-old problems in a sense, or age-old challenges. Perhaps they're not problems, they're opportunities, but the mixing of languages and the way in which people handle that, and the way in which they name places, often involving a mixture of those languages, and some of which the sense is now preserved, some of which we've probably lost what those words originally meant.
And some of the I find myself as a gateway to language. The most Welsh I know, the most Icelandic I know, the most French I know are the place names that I go to, right? Like I know the Icelandic for waterfall because of Skuafoss. I know the Icelandic for glacier because of Skaftafellsjökull. The places that we go to and the local language, it's a real gateway into that language. So Harry, like the place names in and around Merthyr County Borough Council and all that area, we can really learn a lot about the Welsh language and what things mean through those places, right?
Gallwn, ond hefyd wrth ystyried beth mae pawb newydd ddweud a sut falle mae hanes yn newid dros yr oesoedd, mae hynny falle yn cael ei adlewyrchu yn enwau lleoedd sy'n lleol i Cwm Taf a Cwm Rhondda. Fel enghraifft, dyn ni'n gweld sawl enw sy'n gysylltiedig efo Brychan-Brycheiniog, fel Gwawr a Tanglwystl a Rhin, enghraifft. Ond mae hynna'n awgrymu bod yr enwau yma mynd nôl canrifoedd, ond efallai maen nhw gyd yn tarddu o'r 19th ganrif, falle, gyda y pobl fel Iolo Morgannwg yn ail ddarganfod hanes hen Gymru.
So, there's so much that we could and should delve into with languages, with literacy, with numeracy, things like poetry, things like, just more in depth about the Welsh language. But I want to move on quickly to some of the things that are more inside my wheelhouse, things like maths, numeracy, science, technology, engineering, and the likes. And because, again, they overlap. And it's one thing that I found with this project time and time again is that you dip into one topic and one subject, and you suddenly find yourself within another one without even thinking about it. So, the amount of times we talk about maps within this, and I think it's a really good place to talk about mathematics and coordinates and grid references and things like that. When you get into maths, like the places, we have a really weird thing in Wales where we call something North Wales and South Wales and West Wales. Don't really have an East Wales, but coordinates and grid references is a massive thing that is taught in maths. But it's something that I just enjoy spending my time doing. Tim, I know that your life is looking at maps too. Yeah,
I'm a big fan of maps, and I think this project lends itself well to exploring maps and the components of maps via maths and numeracy lessons. So clearly there's the development of maps, and we could look at asking children to put together maps of the region, and clearly the older they are, the more developed those maps could be. It might not just be place names, they might also be detailing the topography, landscape, etc. But you could also explore then grids and coordinates and look at bearings and bring that round then to navigation. And there's a whole health and well-being aspect that we could explore via that, getting out and about. But before we look at that, there's also, we touched on it in the humanities section, there's geographic information systems which overlap into this. As you were saying, Hugh, there's some big overlaps here. There's a whole world of computerized mapping and analysis that crosses over into the maths. We haven't really touched on information technology, but it spans all of these parts of the curriculum. And just to go back to health and well-being there, the project's got a big focus on health and well-being. It features across most of Welsh policy nowadays, and education is no exception to that. Getting out and about and exploring these places is a good way to learn about place names and learn about the landscape and the history that's forms the basis for some of those place names. But it's also a good opportunity to explore perhaps some of the reasons why we're looking at this project. So one of the main reasons that or concerns anyway that is causing place names to be lost are fitness tracking platforms and the ability to name your routes and parts of your routes on these platforms. And whilst we're not sort of saying you can't name them what you like, clearly you can. I think the message here is just encouraging people to think a little bit more about what they name those routes and parts of the routes, and perhaps use some of the more traditional Welsh place names or features of the landscape or some of the cultural heritage which exists in the landscape to name them. Harry, I know this is something close to your heart, and you're a user of some of these platforms. Are there any particular examples where you think more could have been done to perhaps recognise the Welsh landscape and place names in the naming of some of them?
Wel, yr un sy'n nghyfforddi fi mwy nag unrhyw un arall yw Copper Canyon, sydd, dyw e ddim yng Nghymru, dyw e ddim yn y Banau Brycheiniog, a dyw e ddim yn Merthyr Tydfil. Mae Copper Canyon yn Mexico. Ond mae'r enw ar un o'r apau yma am Cwm Callan yw Copper Canyon, a dyna un o'r rhesymau nes I gomisiynu'r prosiect yma trwy TACP.
And that's one of the things about the health and well-being part, is that it covers all the different topics. And one of the biggest links between health and well-being and what I think is really part of kind of maths and STEM and geography, geology, humanities is the Duke of Edinburgh Award. There's no reason, I get asked all the time to go on Duke of Edinburgh trips and teach about astronomy alongside it, geography. The trigonometrical surveys of the past was all mathematics. It's the way that we used to, when you get to a trig point on top of a hill, it's the way we used to find out distances between stuff. So trigonometry and maths is inbuilt into the outdoors and the health and well-being part of it, as well as coordinates, as well as grid references and all the rest. And really, when you look at these maps and you're trying to decipher them and there's different coordinates, different grid references, the one thing you can't get away from, especially in maps of Merthyr and the surroundings, is the fact that they'll change over time. They go from looking one way to looking another. And if you can look back through them, what you'll see is that they change vastly, and the Welsh valleys really changed vastly because of things like the industrial age. We became an industrial nation, the first industrial nation, because of our mineral resources, because we had coal, because we had ironworks, because of all the rest of it. And that, for good or for bad, has changed our landscape. So when thinking about the science and technology of our past, because we were world leaders in it, we can't get away from the fact that we were the world leaders in ironworks, in coal. And I'd really love to see this wrap more into the science curriculum, where we teach about problem solving. What were the problems that they would have come up with in the past for getting coal from one place to another? When they come up with a transport system, they come up with a train system to move coal from one place to another, from up in the valleys all the way down to the docks. And they say that necessity is the mother of all invention. And geez, we were good inventors in the past. In our industrial age, when there was a need for it, we really got round to it. And the way that we created furnaces, the way that we created transport, Richard, looking into the past, we were good scientists, right? We were good engineers at the time, and unfortunately, there's not much left with the place names and the landscapes that refers to how good we were at being industrious, science-driven nation.
No. I mean, in terms of physical remains, but we do have companies that are still going today. So GKN, which is a company that builds defence and builds satellites and is a really big tech company, started out life as Guess, Keene and Nettleford in the Dowlais Ironworks. That's where it all began, and that now this is a global tech giant. So I guess in one way the ironworks carried on innovating long after the fires went out in the furnaces themselves. But during that time we touched on some of the technical innovations, and unfortunately you don't really get apart from the furnaces themselves, you don't really get those surviving, but you do get references to some of the place names. So Penydarren, for example, and the famous engine that was built or commissioned in 1802 and actually ran from Merthyr to Abercyn in 1804, which was the first. Lots of people will argue about it, but it was the first a steam locomotive journey with passengers, and cargo. And Samuel Humphrey won a bet, won 1,000 guineas, by all accounts. So Richard Trevithick built that engine, so he was a technological leader at the time. You've got somebody else called Adrian Stevens, who invented the steam whistle, mainly to stop his colleagues and the people working from him dying from exploding steam engines. But there was all of this, and that on top of the other technical innovations of the iron and steel industries. So that's all left its legacy in the place names, in the street names in and around Merthyr.
And I think that one thing we've got to do is come to reckon with our past in fossil fuels, and definitely things for science lessons could be looking at the energy outputs of the coal in Wales, which the Welsh coal was wanted around the world. We shipped around the world. I think in 1913 we shipped close to 60 million tons of coal around the world, because it had good energy output. And looking at the energy output from coal to looking at gas to looking at oil, and then looking at other things like renewable energies, our journey into the future is we were world leaders in fossil fuels at one point. I'd love us to be world leaders in green energy at some point. But looking at the differences between how we get our energy from one thing that we used to be leaders in to what we could be leaders in the future is a great kind of scientific problem-solving method. And Harry, within schools up and down Merthyr, that's the kind of thing that we could be looking at to the future, right? Like in our science lessons, can we make Welsh industry and Welsh education look to the future and look to a more green future?
Mae egni werdd yn bwysig iawn yn lleol. Mae Pen y Cymoedd, sef fferm di-gwynt fwyaf ym Mhryden, sydd yn gallu cyflawni trydan werdd i 15,000 o gartrefi yng Nghymru, wedi sefydlu ar top cwmrondda. Felly dyle addysg ein plant adlewyrchu ar hyn a rhoi cyfle i disgyblion lleol fanteisio ar hyn.
And what a great place to wrap that up on. The Cultural Connections project is part of the Wales Rural Development Plan 2014 to 2020, which is funded by the European Union Fund for Rural Development and the Welsh Government. It is being commissioned by Merthyr Tydfil Cannyborough Council, delivered by TACP UK Limited, Black Mountains Archaeology, GeoArch and Hugh James Media.
Mae CysylltiadauDiwylliannol yn rhan o gynllun datblygu gwledig Cymru 2014 i 2020 a ariannir gan Cronfa Amaethyddol Ewrop ar gyfer datblygu gwledig a Llywodraeth Cymru. Chomisiynwyd gan Cyngor Sirol Bwrdeistref Merthyr Tydfil a chynhyrchwyd gan TACP, Black Mountains Archaeology, GeoArch a Hugh James Media.